Some letters arrive exactly when they're supposed to. Others arrive 52 years too late. Today, Sarah Chen opened her mailbox in a house she'd owned for exactly 3 days, expecting nothing more than bills and grocery store flyers. Instead, she found a single postcard with edges soft as butterfly wings, dated February 14th, 1972. The message was written in fading blue ink. "I'm sorry. I'll be at Café Aurora at 6 p.m., same day, every year." It wasn't addressed to her. It wasn't meant for her. But as she stood there in the afternoon light, holding someone else's half-century-old apology, she realized that some messages transcend their intended recipients. Some words are meant to find exactly the person who needs to hear them, even if it takes 5 decades to make the journey. Have you ever held something in your hands and felt the weight of a story you didn't know you were meant to carry? Part 1. Discovery. Moving into a new home is like stepping into someone else's interrupted dream. The walls hold echoes of conversations you'll never hear. The windows have witnessed sunrises meant for other eyes, and sometimes, if you're very quiet, you can almost feel the lingering warmth of lives that came before you. Sarah had spent 3 days arranging furniture in rooms that felt like beautiful strangers. The Victorian house on Maple Street had called to her the moment she saw it. Something about the way the morning light fell across the hardwood floors, the way the kitchen window framed the neighbor's apple tree, the way the whole place seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the right person to bring it back to life. She'd bought the house from an estate sale. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman had lived there for 63 years before passing peacefully in her sleep last spring. The realtor mentioned that Eleanor had never married, had been a librarian, had kept the most beautiful garden in the neighborhood. But beyond these gentle facts, Eleanor remained a mystery, a previous life that had left behind empty rooms and the faint scent of lavender that still lingered in the bedroom closets. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Sarah decided to walk to the mailbox for the first time as the official resident of 1247 Maple Street. It was one of those October days when the air holds both the warmth of summer's memory and the crisp promise of winter's approach. The maple tree in her front yard had begun its annual transformation, dropping leaves like golden love letters across her path. The mailbox stood at the end of her driveway, like a small, faithful sentinel. It was painted white with green trim, clearly maintained with the same meticulous care that Eleanor had given to everything else. Sarah lifted the metal flag and reached inside, expecting the usual collection of address change confirmations and welcome to the neighborhood coupons. Her fingers found something unexpected. The postcard felt different from the moment she touched it. While the other mail was crisp and modern, this felt soft, weathered, like fabric that had been loved too long. She pulled it out and held it up to the light, immediately noticing the vintage design. A simple illustration of a cafe scene with people in 1970s clothing. The colors faded to the gentle pastels of old photographs. The front bore a stamp she didn't recognize, postmarked February 14th, 1972, but it was the back that made her heart catch in her throat. Written in careful, deliberate handwriting that spoke of fountain pens and taking time with words, the message was brief, but loaded with emotion. "Dear Margaret, I'm sorry. I'll be at Café Aurora at 6 p.m., same day, every year. Forever yours, James." The address was indeed 1247 Maple Street, but it was addressed to Margaret Whitman, not Eleanor. Sarah stood there in the driveway, holding this piece of someone else's heartbreak, feeling like an accidental archaeologist who had just uncovered something precious and fragile. The postcard should have been delivered 52 years ago. Somehow, it had been lost in the vast machinery of the postal system, perhaps stuck behind a sorting machine or fallen into a forgotten corner of some distribution center, only to surface now, decades after its intended moment. It was a message from 1972, arriving in 2024, carrying with it all the weight of words that were never received, an apology that was never heard, a promise that was never witnessed. Sarah found herself reading the message again and again, each time feeling the emotion behind the words more deeply. There was desperation in that, "I'm sorry." There was hope in "same day, every year." There was love and loss and longing all contained in 23 words written in fading blue ink. Standing there with the autumn wind lifting her hair and the golden leaves dancing around her feet, Sarah realized she was holding more than just a postcard. She was holding a love story that time had forgotten, a connection that had been interrupted but never truly broken. She was holding someone's heart. Tell me, when you find something that isn't meant for you but feels like it was always meant to find you, what do you do with that responsibility? Part 2. Curiosity. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with the postcard placed carefully in front of her, as if it were a museum artifact that might crumble if handled too roughly. She'd made herself tea, chamomile, because something about the postcard seemed to call for the kind of gentle ritual that Eleanor might have enjoyed, and she found herself studying every detail of this accidental delivery. The handwriting was unmistakably masculine, written with the kind of care that suggested the words had been chosen and reconsidered, probably multiple times. The ink had faded from what was likely once a deep blue to a color that reminded Sarah of twilight skies. There were no smudges, no hurried scratches. This was a message that had been crafted with intention, with love, with the desperate hope that it would bridge whatever distance had grown between two hearts. Margaret Whitman. Sarah rolled the name around in her mind, trying to imagine the woman who should have received this message in 1972. The realtor had said Eleanor never married, had lived alone in this house for over 6 decades. But who was Margaret? A sister, a daughter? Or perhaps Eleanor had been Margaret once before life led her to become someone else entirely. The questions multiplied like ripples in still water. What had James done that required such an apology? Why had he chosen a postcard instead of a phone call or a visit? What was Café Aurora, and did it still exist? Most importantly, had James kept his promise? Had he really gone to that cafe at 6 p.m. on February 14th every year since 1972, waiting for someone who never came because she never knew he was sorry? Sarah found herself doing what any modern person does when faced with a mystery. She turned to the internet. But searching for Margaret Whitman 1972 yielded nothing helpful. James Café Aurora brought up restaurant reviews and coffee shop locations, but nothing that seemed connected to her postcard. The trail felt cold before it had even begun. But then she remembered something. Eleanor had been a librarian. If anyone would have kept records, would have preserved the stories of her community, it would have been someone who had spent her life caring for books and the memories they contained. The next morning, Sarah found herself walking through Eleanor's house with new eyes, looking for clues instead of just seeing rooms to be redecorated. In the study, she discovered something she had initially dismissed as just old furniture. A beautiful oak desk with multiple drawers, each one neatly organized with the precision of someone who had spent decades cataloging information. In the bottom drawer, wrapped in tissue paper that smelled of lavender and thyme, Sarah found a collection of photographs. Most were of Eleanor at various ages, as a young woman with victory rolls in her hair, as a middle-aged librarian surrounded by books, as an elderly lady in her garden, always alone but never looking lonely. But tucked between these solo portraits was something that made Sarah's breath catch. It was a photograph of 2 young women, arms linked, laughing at something beyond the camera's view. One was clearly Eleanor, maybe 20 years old, her face bright with the kind of joy that seems impossible to contain. The other woman had darker hair, deeper eyes, and a smile that seemed to hold secrets. On the back, in Eleanor's careful handwriting, Margaret and Eleanor, summer 1971, sisters of the heart. Sarah sank into Eleanor's desk chair, the photograph trembling in her hands. Margaret wasn't Eleanor's sister by blood. She was something deeper, something chosen. They were best friends, the kind of friendship that feels like coming home, the kind that makes you believe you can weather any storm as long as you have each other, which made the postcard even more heartbreaking. If Margaret and Eleanor were as close as this photograph suggested, why hadn't Margaret lived here? What had happened to separate them? And why had Eleanor never married, never shared this beautiful house with anyone else? As Sarah sat there surrounded by Eleanor's memories, she began to construct a story in her mind. Maybe Margaret had left town, perhaps for college or career or love. Maybe James was someone Margaret had met in her new life, someone she had fallen for and then left behind. Maybe the apology was for choosing Eleanor's friendship over James's love, or for breaking a promise, or for simply disappearing without explanation. But the more Sarah thought about it, the more questions arose. If Eleanor and Margaret were such close friends, wouldn't Eleanor have told Margaret about James coming to the cafe? Wouldn't she have passed along the message somehow, unless something had happened that made that impossible? That afternoon, Sarah found herself walking to the local library, the same library where Eleanor had worked for 37 years. If answers existed, they would be there, preserved in the careful records that librarians keep of their community's stories. The current librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had worked alongside Eleanor for 15 years, welcomed Sarah with the gentle warmth that seems to be a requirement for the profession. When Sarah explained about the postcard and the photograph, Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted to something deeper, recognition mixed with sadness. "Oh, my dear," she said softly, leading Sarah to a quiet corner table. "Eleanor never told you about Margaret, did she? But then she never told anyone. It was too painful, even after all these years. And so in the hushed sanctuary of the library, where Eleanor had spent most of her adult life, Sarah learned the truth that had been carefully guarded for over 5 decades. Have you ever discovered that the story you thought you understood was actually just the first chapter of something much more complex, much more beautiful, and much more heartbreaking than you could have imagined? Part 3. The Visit. Margaret Whitman had died in a car accident on February 10, 1972, 4 days before she would have received James's postcard, 4 days before she would have known he was sorry, 4 days before she could have met him at Café Aurora to hear whatever words he had been carrying in his heart. Mrs. Patterson spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of a secret that had been kept out of love and grief. Eleanor had been devastated by Margaret's death, but what made it worse was the guilt. They had fought just before Margaret left town. Not a serious argument, just the kind of disagreement that feels insignificant until it becomes the last conversation you ever have with someone you love. Margaret had fallen in love with James during her final semester of college. He was a poetry student, dreamy and romantic, the kind of young man who wrote love letters and believed in grand gestures. But he was also unreliable, prone to disappearing for days at a time, swept up in his art and his emotions. Eleanor had tried to warn Margaret, had tried to protect her friend from what she saw as inevitable heartbreak. The fight had been about James. Eleanor had begged Margaret not to follow him to the city, not to give up her teaching position for someone who couldn't even remember to call when he said he would. Margaret had accused Eleanor of being jealous, of not understanding what real love felt like. They had both said things they didn't mean, words chosen specifically to wound. Margaret had left for the city anyway, and Eleanor had been too proud to call and apologize. Then came the phone call from Margaret's sister. A car had skidded on icy roads and Margaret was gone, taking with her any chance for reconciliation, any possibility of forgiveness. Eleanor had never married because she had already given her heart to someone, not romantically, but in the deeper way that friendship can claim a soul. She had spent 52 years living with the knowledge that her last words to her dearest friend had been spoken in anger, and that Margaret had died not knowing how sorry Eleanor was, how much she had been loved, how every February 14th for the rest of Eleanor's life had been spent thinking about words that were never said. "But James," Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to James?" Mrs. Patterson smiled sadly. "Café Aurora is still there, dear, downtown on 5th Street. Eleanor used to walk past it every February 14th just to see. I think she always hoped that someday she might find the courage to go inside and tell him what had happened to Margaret. But she never did. Some grief is too heavy to share with strangers." That evening, Sarah sat in her kitchen with the postcard and the photograph side by side, feeling the weight of 2 different kinds of love, the passionate, complicated love between Margaret and James, and the deep, enduring love between Margaret and Eleanor. Both relationships had been left unfinished, both stories interrupted by timing and pride and the terrible randomness of fate. But here was the remarkable thing. The postcard had found its way to Sarah 52 years later, on the exact street where Margaret should have received it, in the house where her best friend had spent decades keeping her memory alive. It had arrived in the hands of someone who had the time to care, the curiosity to investigate, and perhaps the courage to do what Eleanor never could. February 14th was still 3 days away. Sarah found herself wondering about James. If he was still alive, if he had really kept his promise all these years. Would he be at Café Aurora tomorrow at 6 p.m., an old man still carrying the weight of words he had never been able to say? Or had he eventually given up, assuming that Margaret's silence was her answer to his apology? There was only one way to find out. The next day, Sarah dressed carefully, as if she were preparing for a sacred ritual. She chose a vintage dress that seemed appropriate for carrying a 52-year-old message, and she placed the postcard in an envelope to protect it from the February wind. She arrived at Café Aurora at 5:30, wanting to observe before she acted, wanting to understand the space that had held such significance for two people she had never met. The café was exactly what Sarah had imagined, a small intimate space with mismatched chairs and tables that looked like they had been there since the 1970s. The walls were covered with local artwork and old photographs, and the whole place had the comfortable, lived-in feeling of somewhere that had been serving coffee and harboring conversations for decades. Sarah ordered tea and chose a table near the window where she could watch both the door and the street. At exactly 6 p.m., she saw him. He was older than she had expected, but younger than she had feared. Probably in his mid-70s, walking with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to carry grief gracefully. He paused outside the café, looking through the window with the expression of someone who had performed this ritual so many times that it had become both heartbreaking and comforting. When he entered, Sarah noticed that the barista nodded at him with familiar warmth. This was clearly a regular occurrence, a monthly pilgrimage that the staff had learned to respect without question. He ordered coffee, black, no sugar, and chose the same table he had probably chosen for 52 years, the one in the corner with a view of the door. And then he waited. Sarah watched him check his watch, smooth his hair, arrange and rearrange the napkin in front of him. These were the nervous gestures of someone who still hoped, despite 5 decades of disappointment, that this time might be different. This time, she might walk through the door. What do you do when you're holding someone else's answer to a prayer they've been praying for 52 years? Part 4. The moment Sarah sat with the envelope in her hands for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Across the café, James, she was certain now that this was James, continued his patient vigil, occasionally glancing at the door with the kind of hope that had somehow survived decades of disappointment. She thought about Eleanor, who had walked past this café every February 14th, but had never found the courage to enter. She thought about Margaret, who had died not knowing that James was sorry, not knowing that he had loved her enough to keep showing up year after year. She thought about all the words that go unspoken, all the apologies that arrive too late, all the love stories that end before they've had a chance to find their proper conclusion. But here's what Sarah realized as she sat there. Sometimes love stories don't end with the original characters. Sometimes they continue through the kindness of strangers, through the unexpected mercy of coincidence, through the willingness of one person to carry another's message across the years. She stood up and walked to James's table, her heart beating so loudly she was certain the entire café could hear it. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you James?" He looked up at her with startled eyes, the kind of expression someone wears when their most impossible dream seems to be coming true. For a moment, she thought he might mistake her for Margaret. There was such sudden joy in his face that Sarah almost couldn't bear to continue. "My name is Sarah," she said quickly, sitting down across from him before her courage could fail. "I'm not Margaret, but I have something that belongs to you. Well, to both of you, really." She placed the envelope on the table between them, and James stared at it as if it might disappear if he looked away. "I just moved into 1247 Maple Street," Sarah continued. "Eleanor Whitman's house. This was in my mailbox 3 days ago." With trembling hands, James opened the envelope and pulled out the postcard. His face went through a series of emotions: recognition, disbelief, pain, and finally, a kind of peaceful amazement. "I wrote this," he said, his voice barely audible. "I wrote this 52 years ago. I know," Sarah said gently. "I know you've been coming here every year, waiting for her. James nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally looked up at Sarah, his eyes were filled with tears, but they weren't entirely sad tears. "She never got it," he said. "All these years I thought she had gotten my apology and chosen not to forgive me. I thought she had decided I wasn't worth meeting." "James," Sarah said, reaching across the table to touch his hand, "Margaret died 4 days before this postcard was supposed to be delivered. She never knew you were sorry. She never knew you were waiting." The silence that followed was profound, not empty, but full of the weight of understanding, of puzzle pieces finally clicking into place, of a 52-year-old question finally finding its answer. "She died?" James whispered. Sarah nodded. "In a car accident, February 10th, 1972. James sat back in his chair, processing this information that changed everything and nothing all at once. Margaret was still gone. He had still lost her. But now he knew that she hadn't chosen to reject his love. Fate had made that choice for both of them. "I've been coming here for 52 years, he said wonderingly. "Every February 14th, 6 p.m., just like I promised. Even after I got married, even after my wife died, even when I was sick and could barely walk. I kept coming because I gave my word." Sarah felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. "She would have come," she said with certainty. "If she had gotten your message, she would have been here." James picked up the postcard again, running his fingers over the words he had written so long ago. "What did I do wrong?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. "I can't even remember now what I was apologizing for. Some stupid fight, some moment of pride or jealousy or fear. It seemed so important at the time." "Love makes everything feel important," Sarah said. "And sometimes the smallest hurts require the biggest apologies." They sat together in comfortable silence, two strangers connected by a love story that had taken 52 years to find its conclusion. Around them, the cafe continued its evening rhythm, conversations and laughter, the hiss of the espresso machine, the gentle clink of cups and saucers. Life continuing as it always does around moments of profound change. "There's something else," Sarah said eventually. She pulled out her phone and showed James the photograph of Eleanor and Margaret. "Margaret's best friend kept her memory alive all these years. She lived in the house where your postcard was delivered. She walked past this cafe every February 14th, but she never came in. I think she was carrying her own guilt about their last conversation." James studied the photograph, seeing Margaret young and happy, frozen in a moment of pure joy. They looked like they loved each other very much. They did. Eleanor never married, never shared her life with anyone else. I think losing Margaret broke something in her that never quite healed. And now they're both gone, James said softly. "But their story isn't," Sarah replied. "Their love isn't. It found its way to me, and now it's found its way to you. That has to mean something." James smiled for the first time since she had sat down. "You know what I think it means?" Sarah shook her head. "I think it means that love is stronger than time, stronger than death, stronger than the mistakes we make and the words we don't say. This postcard traveled 52 years to get here, to this moment, to bring us together, so that Margaret's story could finally be told completely, so that I could finally know the truth, and so that someone else could know that love like ours, imperfect and interrupted, still matters." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks, though she couldn't say exactly when she had started crying. "What will you do now?" James carefully folded the postcard and placed it in his wallet. "I think I'll keep coming here on February 14th, not to wait for Margaret anymore. I understand now that she's not coming. But to remember her, to honor what we had, and to celebrate the fact that somehow, impossibly, love found a way to complete our story." He stood up to leave, then turned back to Sarah. "Thank you," he said, "for bringing this to me, for caring about strangers, for believing that old love stories still matter." After he left, Sarah sat alone at the table watching the February evening settle over the city. She thought about the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. Eleanor's death, her own decision to buy the house, the postal system's 52-year mistake, her own curiosity and courage. It seemed impossible that so many small coincidences could align to create such a perfect resolution. But maybe that's how love works. Maybe it's always finding ways to complete itself, to heal the wounds it leaves behind. to ensure that no true connection is ever really lost. Maybe every love story gets the ending it deserves, even if it takes 5 decades to arrive. Closing reflection. As Sarah walked home through the February night, she realized that she had become part of Margaret and James's love story, just as Eleanor had been, just as anyone who carries another person's heart becomes part of their narrative. Love, she understood now, is not just something that happens between two people. It's something that ripples outward, touching strangers, crossing decades, finding ways to heal and complete and continue, even when the original lovers are gone. She thought about all the letters that get lost, all the apologies that arrive too late, all the love that goes unexpressed because we assume we have more time than we do. But she also thought about the postcard in James's wallet, about the photograph on her kitchen table, about the cafe that had served as a temple of faithfulness for 52 years. Some stories, Sarah realized, are bigger than the people who start them. Some love transcends the lovers themselves, becoming something larger and more enduring, a testament to the power of commitment, the beauty of hope, the possibility that even our deepest griefs can eventually find their way to grace. The house on Maple Street welcomed her home with warm windows and the lingering scent of lavender. As she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself thinking about Eleanor and Margaret, young and laughing in that photograph, sisters of the heart who had loved each other through friendship and fought with each other over love, and lost each other to pride and death and time. But they weren't really lost, were they? Their love had found a way to continue through Sarah's curiosity, through James's faithfulness, through the mysterious workings of a postal system that had somehow known to hold on to one small message until exactly the right moment to deliver it. Love, Sarah thought as she drifted off to sleep, really is stronger than time. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, if we're paying attention, if we're brave enough to carry other people's stories in our hearts, we get to be the ones who help love find its way home. Do you believe in love that transcends time? In messages that travel decades to find their intended recipients? In the possibility that our own love stories are still being written, still finding ways to complete themselves, even when we think they've ended? Because somewhere in a cafe on 5th Street, an old man sits at the same table every February 14th, no longer waiting but remembering, no longer hoping but grateful, carrying in his wallet a postcard that took 52 years to deliver. Its message of love that was stronger than death, deeper than disappointment, and more enduring than time itself. And that perhaps is the most beautiful love story of all. Not the one that gets its happy ending immediately, but the one that waits patiently for decades to remind us that some things are worth holding on to, some promises are worth keeping, and some love stories are so powerful that they continue long after their final chapter has been written. The postcard from 1972 has found its home at last. But the love it carried, that love will continue forever, passed from heart to heart, from story to story, from one February evening to the next, ensuring that Margaret and James and Eleanor and all the rest of us who have ever loved and lost and hoped and waited will never really be forgotten. Because love, as it turns out, is the one thing that the postal service of the universe never fails to deliver. It might take 52 years, but it always finds its way home.